You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
There is no substitute for victory.
I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
We are Americans.
I ask for your prayers and your support as our country continues its vital role as a leader for world peace.
Well, I believe there's a better way of eliminating the threat of nuclear war.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference.
The following pre-recorded political program is sponsored by TV for Goldwater Miller on behalf of Barry Goldwater, Republican candidate for President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, we take pride in presenting a thoughtful address by Ronald Reagan.
I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course. I believe that the issues confronting us cross party lines.
1 week before the presidential election of 1964, Ronald Reagan delivered a 27-minute speech for television endorsing Republican candidate Barry Goldwater.
Winston Churchill said the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals. And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith that you and I have the ability and the dignity and the right to make our own decisions and determine our own destiny.
Although Goldwater lost the election in a landslide to incumbent Democrat Lyndon Johnson, Ronald Reagan's powerful speech had won the hearts and minds of many in his party. And at age 53, the veteran actor had come upon his own rendezvous with destiny. As fate would have it, Ronald Reagan had played his first major role in what was to become a legendary career in American politics. Officially, Reagan's political career began in 1966 when he announced his intention to run for governor of California against Pat Brown, who was running on the Democratic ticket for a third consecutive term. When asked by his party to run against the man who had won over former Vice President Richard Nixon 4 years earlier, Reagan was skeptical. "I'm an actor, not a politician," he said. Nevertheless, influential friends and party members persevered, and eventually Reagan was convinced to run, even though he had never run for a position in public office before. When election time came in November of 1966, Reagan upset his opponent and was elected governor of California by a substantial margin.
He won by 1 million votes, which would be the equivalent of winning by about 2 million votes now against a guy who was one of the best politicians in the state, had beaten Richard Nixon, 4 years earlier. That was one heck of a way to start your political career.
In January of 1967, Ronald Reagan was sworn in as California's 33rd governor.
Ronald Reagan was not, in my view, a good governor at first. We asked him what kind of a governor he would be. He had this wonderful sense of humor, and he says, "I don't know, I've never played a governor." Actually, it proved a pretty demanding role.
Reagan's first term extended through one of the most tumultuous times in American history. The years of post-war prosperity had given way to an era of internal dissent as issues of civil rights and the escalating war in Vietnam ignited a wildfire of social unrest throughout the country. California was no exception. Much of Reagan's first term was devoted to restoring order to college campuses across the state, as schools such as the University of California at Berkeley became battlegrounds for student demonstrations that often resulted in violent confrontations with authority. In other areas of policy, Reagan was quite effective in state finances and was able to transform the deficit he inherited from Pat Brown into a state surplus. Reagan also introduced various business methods that helped improve legislative efficacy. By 1969, his approval ratings were high, and he was elected to another term.
He was simultaneously an ideologue and a pragmatist. He wouldn't allow you to call him a politician, but he was a very, very good politician. He was a practical politician. And I think that most people would agree that he was a successful governor in his second year. He put aside more parklands, by the way, than any governor except Earl Warren in the history of the state. And what is most important is that he became a steadily better governor. He was a better governor in his second term than he was in his first.
Reagan's second term as governor extended through 4 years many Americans would like to forget. It was the time of the OPEC oil embargo, America's humiliating defeat in Vietnam, and the first time in history that an American president resigned in disgrace. Despite the country's woes, Reagan's California prospered, and after accomplishing most of what he set out to do, Reagan left Sacramento at the outset of 1975 and retreated to his ranch in Santa Barbara, California at age 63. However, Reagan's political respite was short-lived, and his supporters soon called upon him to serve once again, this time as a candidate for the highest office in the United States.
On November 20th, I announced my decision to seek the Republican nomination for the presidency.
He was showing these half-hour television shows late at night, challenging President Ford, and he won the North Carolina primary. Once he did that, he became a competitor for the nomination, because as the nominating process moved west and south into Reagan country, he did very well. And he came up 117 votes short.
I would be honored on your behalf to ask my good friend, Governor Reagan, to say a few words at this time.
He came down where he was cheered after losing, and he gave a speech, and he didn't have any notes. And his speech is about the great danger that faces the world is nuclear war.
We live in a world in which the great powers have poised and aimed at each other horrible missiles of destruction, nuclear weapons that can in a matter of minutes arrive in each other's country and destroy virtually the civilized world we live in.
That is not the speech of a guy who is retiring to his ranch. And there was never any doubt in the minds of any of us who knew Reagan that he was going to run again for president.
We must go forth from here united, determined that what a great general said a few years ago is true. There is no substitute for victory. Mr. President.
Gerald Ford lost the presidency to Jimmy Carter, and 4 years later, Ronald Reagan sought the GOP nomination once again, this time with different results.
With a deep awareness of the responsibility conferred by your trust, I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
Reagan's bid for the presidency came at a time when the nation's collective confidence seemed to be running desperately low. 51 American hostages were still held in Iran after Iranian protesters seized the American embassy in November of 1979. The threat of nuclear devastation struck fear in the hearts of all Americans, and record unemployment, staggering interest rates, and inflation crippled the national economy.
When he set out in 1980 in the campaign to revitalize the economy at a time when we were in our worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, when he set out to rebuild our national defense at a time when our armed forces had deteriorated considerably, and when he set out to restore America's position of leadership when we were really down in the dumps as far as the rest of the world was concerned, I think people resonated to that.
Everywhere I travel in America today, I hear this phrase over and over again. Everything is going up. Where's it going to end? Record inflation has robbed the purchasing power of your dollar. And for 3.5 years, this administration has been unable to control it. When President Ford left office at the end of 1976, the inflation rate was around 5%. Jimmy Carter told us that was too high, much too high. Well, this year, Carter inflation has hit 18%. I'm very worried, as all Americans are, and I'm prepared to do something about it.
As the presidential race entered the home stretch, Reagan and Carter squared off in a televised debate 1 week before the election.
Governor Reagan, again, typically is against such a proposal.
Governor, there you go again.
Throughout the debate, Reagan's presence overshadowed Carter, and his closing statement struck a resounding chord in America's conscience.
Next Tuesday is Election Day. Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls. You'll stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off
than you were 4 years ago?
The polls on the weekend before the election were dead even. I'm not just talking about Carter's polls or the national polls. I'm talking about Ronald Reagan's polls. People, right up to the weekend before the election, weren't decided what they wanted to do. And then that Sunday before the election, the Ayatollah Khomeini pushed one more time against Jimmy Carter, and everyone said, that's it. That's it, Jimmy. Go on home to Georgia. We're going to elect Ronald Reagan. He won by a large majority. And he brought to the office his political ideology and philosophy, which he understood full well. And it was part of his political strength. You knew where Ronald Reagan stood. He told you what he wanted to do with the presidency before he came, and he made every effort to do it once he got there.
It is my intention to curb the size and influence of the federal establishment and to demand recognition of the distinction between the powers granted to the federal government and those reserved to the states or to the people. If we look to the answer as to why for so many years we achieved so much, prospered as no other people on earth, it was because here in this land we unleashed the energy and individual genius of man to a greater extent than has ever been done before. Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth. The price for this freedom at times has been high, but we have never been unwilling to pay that price. It does require, however, our best effort and our willingness to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to perform great deeds, to believe that together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans. God bless you and thank you.
On the day of his inauguration, President Reagan made an announcement that every American so longed to hear.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
After 444 long days in captivity, the hostages arrived on American soil and received a hero's welcome. Only 2 months after his inauguration, President Reagan was shot in the chest during an assassination attempt while leaving the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. by 25-year-old John Hinckley.
When he was shot, he says to his wife, and he almost died, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And he says to the doctors, as they're about to put him under to try to remove this bullet, which was that close to his heart, "Well, I hope everybody in this room is Republican." And the doctors said, "Well, Mr. President, today all of us are Republicans." In fact, the chief doctor was a Democrat who saved his life.
Reagan made a full recovery, yet his press secretary James Brady suffered severe head wounds that resulted in permanent brain damage. 12 days after the shooting, Reagan returned to the White House, poised and ready to implement his next big move, a tax cut that he hoped would stoke the fires of business and put the American economy back on track.
Our bill is, in short, the first real tax cut for everyone in almost 20 years. Our bipartisan bill gives a 25% reduction over 3 years.
The bill called for a 25% cut in individual tax rates and major cuts for oil producers and other big businesses. In July, the bill passed through the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives, and Reagan claimed victory.
I do so swear.
That same month, Reagan set historical precedents by appointing the first woman Supreme Court justice in American history. Sandra Day O'Connor was promoted from the Arizona Court of Appeals and was quickly confirmed by the U.S. Senate in September of 1981.
Reagan's talent was obviously in picking people who could do what he believed should be done, who had helped him believe what should be done, indeed, and using them as his advisors, indeed his cabinet in many cases, and letting them run the show. That was effective in getting done what he wanted.
Meanwhile, recent events in Poland had captured the imagination of the free world, and Ronald Reagan watched intently as the Solidarity movement pushed for democratic reform. The movement began in 1980 when workers at the Lenin shipyard incited a nationwide strike in demand of labor reform. Led by Lech Walesa, the workers formed the Solidarity Union and compelled the Polish government to sign an unprecedented agreement granting new rights to Polish workers. In the months to come, the union strikes escalated until late in 1981, when the Soviet-backed regime banned Solidarity altogether and imposed martial law. As a former union head himself, Reagan vehemently supported Solidarity and was quick to denounce the crackdown.
The peaceful efforts of Solidarity have been met with brutal repression. A dark night of tyranny has descended on Poland. The target of this repression is the Solidarity movement, but in attacking Solidarity, its enemies attack an entire people. America has already acted firmly and deliberately on behalf of Polish freedom. We have announced sanctions against the Polish military government and the Soviet government that backs its suppression. We, the people of the free world, stand as one with our Polish brothers and sisters.
I have the high privilege and the distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Congress, honored guests, and fellow citizens. Today marks my first State of the Union address to you, a constitutional duty as old as our republic itself. President Washington began this tradition in 1790 after reminding the nation that the destiny of self-government and the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty is finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. For our friends in the press who place a high premium on accuracy, let me say, I did not actually hear George Washington say that.
Reagan's second year in office marked a new chapter in the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. In June of 1982, Israel invaded its northern neighbor Lebanon in order to drive out the growing threat of Palestinian forces. Once again, Lebanon became a battle zone for warring factions, and once again the civilian population was caught in the crossfire. Committed to end the violence, President Reagan sent U.S. Marines into Lebanon to assist in a multinational peacekeeping force and urged Israel to withdraw.
We must pave the way for withdrawal of foreign forces. The place to begin this task is in Beirut. We have agreed to form a new multinational force with the mission of enabling the Lebanese government to resume full sovereignty over its capital. For this multinational force to succeed, it is essential that Israel withdraw from Beirut. The whole world will be a safer place when this region, which has known so much trouble, can begin to know peace instead. Both our purpose and our actions are peaceful, and we're taking them in a spirit of international cooperation. So tonight, I ask for your prayers and your support as our country continues its vital role as a leader for world peace.
Because of what happened in the surrounding political atmosphere in the Arab-Israeli conflict, we became the targets instead of peacekeepers.
This past Sunday, at 22 minutes after 6 Beirut time, with dawn just breaking, a truck, looking like a lot of other vehicles in the city, approached the airport on a busy main road. There was nothing in its appearance to suggest it was any different than the trucks or cars that were normally seen on and around the airport. But this one was different. At the wheel was a young man on a suicide mission. The truck carried some 2,000 pounds of explosives. But there was no way our Marine Guards could know this. Their first warning that something was wrong came when the truck crashed through a series of barriers, including a chain-link fence and barbed wire entanglements. The guards opened fire, but it was too late. The truck smashed through the doors of the headquarters building in which our Marines were sleeping and instantly exploded. The 4-story concrete building collapsed in a pile of rubble. More than 200 of the sleeping men were killed in that one hideous, insane attack. Many others suffered injury and are hospitalized here or in Europe. We're a nation with global responsibilities. We're not somewhere else in the world protecting someone else's interests. We're there protecting our own.
In a move to protect American interests in Latin America, President Reagan ordered the invasion of a tiny Caribbean nation called Grenada just days after the Marine barracks bombing.
Grenada, we were told, was a friendly island paradise for tourism. Well, it wasn't. It was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a major military bastion to export terror and undermine democracy. We got there just in time.
The immediate cause of the Grenada invasion, of course, was the very brutal replacement of Maurice Bishop's government by Cord and Austin. I mean, really of the most brutal type of just going in and murdering everybody, and you know, and I think that sort of shocked, certainly it shocked the Central American, the Caribbean community greatly. The Cuban presence on Grenada was disturbing, and of course you had a whole bunch of U.S. students down there in medical school, and they truly felt that they were in a hostage situation. And our number one objective in going in was really to rescue those American students, okay? Secondly, it was also to restore the remnants of the Maurice Bishop government and put them back in to be the legitimate government of Grenada.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
That same year, President Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to protect America from nuclear missile attacks by building a new space-based defense system, later dubbed as Star Wars.
I am directing a comprehensive and intensive effort to define a long-term research and development program to begin to achieve our ultimate goal of eliminating the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles.
Ronald Reagan believed that anything that the mind of man could conceive, it could accomplish. That's both a strength and a weakness of him. He thought that it would be possible to construct this super shield, and there was really, all the scientific evidence suggested otherwise, that you couldn't, it wasn't, if you stop 90% of the Soviet missiles, it ain't going to do the job. You got to stop all of them. And nobody thought you could do that. But it had an impact. It had an enormous impact on the Soviet Union.
For the past 20 years, we've believed that no war will be launched as long as each side knows it can retaliate with a deadly counterstrike. Well, I believe there's a better way of eliminating the threat of nuclear war. It is a strategic defense initiative aimed ultimately at finding a non-nuclear defense against ballistic missiles. It's the most hopeful possibility of the nuclear age.
Delegates to this convention and fellow citizens, tonight with a full heart and deep gratitude for your trust, I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
1984 was an election year, and Reagan faced competition from former Vice President Walter Mondale, who broke new ground by choosing New York Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro to be his running mate. 73 years of age, the question of Reagan being too old to effectively govern became a key issue. For those who had any doubt, Reagan had the answer.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
When November came, The country was in no mood to alter course, and Ronald Reagan swept 49 states, along with 59% of the popular vote.
It was only after the Carter presidency and the election of Ronald Reagan that it seemed to me we returned to any sort of stability or equilibrium in the political system in the country. And that may be Ronald Reagan's greatest contribution. He brought stability to the system. I think by the same token that dismantling much of the bureaucracy of government and reducing the burden of taxation stoked the fires of economic and social progress in this country, and we are now reaping the reward.
When I took this oath 4 years ago, I did so in a time of economic stress. Voices were raised saying that we had to look to our past for the greatness and glory. But we, the present-day Americans, are not given to looking backward. In this blessed land, there is always a better tomorrow.
He was a leader when it came to optimism. And far beyond the very acts of his presidency, he brought to this country a renewal of that optimism. And I think it can be properly argued that that helped the country then move ahead.
As optimism grew and the country moved ahead, other parts of the world struggled. In the country of South Africa, violence and oppression plagued the nation. By 1985, an estimated 3.5 million South African blacks had been forced to leave their homes for relocation to segregated townships by the white minority apartheid government. Those who protested were often killed or imprisoned. The Reagan administration responded by tightening embargoes and other punitive sanctions.
We feel a moral responsibility to speak out on this matter, to emphasize our concerns and our grief over the human and spiritual costs of apartheid in South Africa, to call upon the government of South Africa to reach out to its black majority by ending the forced removal of blacks from their communities and the detention without trial and lengthy imprisonment of black leaders.
Elsewhere in Africa, famine had reached a staggering level in the country of Ethiopia, and thousands of people perished daily of malnutrition. As graphic pictures of starving children reached the well-to-do nations of the world, Ronald Reagan acted swiftly to aid in a multinational relief effort.
I will shortly propose legislation to create a $50 million presidential fund allowing us to set aside existing foreign aid resources to meet emergency food aid needs.
Closer to home, Reagan turned a watchful eye to the Central American country of Nicaragua, where the Sandinista government, led by Daniel Ortega, moved to expand its communist influence.
The Nicaraguan government is a revolutionary government that took power by force, but with the promise of democratic elections, none of which have taken place. The Nicaraguan government had pledged to the United States that it would not attempt to overthrow any other governments in Central America, particularly El Salvador, by helping the insurgents there, the guerrillas, and they violated that promise, and they are still violating it. And anything that we're doing in that area is simply trying to interdict the supply lines which are supplying the guerrillas in El Salvador.
To counter the threat, the Reagan administration provided aid to a small insurgent force of guerrillas known as the Contras.
Thus began a little civil war in Nicaragua, Sandinistas versus the Contras. And in 1984, the Congress of the United States passed a law prohibiting any sort of military aid to the Contras.
With his hands tied, Reagan's hope for democracy in Nicaragua would have to wait. Of all of Reagan's concerns, the most foreboding was the building tension with the Soviet Union. In the early 1980s, U.S.-Soviet relations seemed to be at an all-time low, and the arms race continued at a staggering pace.
Each year, the Soviets were adding more intercontinental strategic ballistic missile warheads to their force than we had in our force total. They were adding more each year.
Reagan's peace through strength policy called for a massive military buildup and left many uncertain of the world's future.
Ronald Reagan always conceived of a military buildup as a means toward an end. He promised a massive military buildup during his 1980 campaign. but he never saw this as something that was an intrinsic good.
President Reagan saw it not as action to defeat communism. He always believed that it would defeat itself because it was a false ideology. It could not stand over time. And so what President Reagan did was to contain them by giving them a show of strength that was unmistakable, by building up the armed forces of the United States, the Reagan buildup in his first term, and making sure the Soviets saw a president who was willing to take them on wherever they needed to be taken on, and would make the investment and put the will of the American people behind that defense effort. Having done that, then what Reagan did, and he doesn't get enough credit for, is he then engaged them.
In November of 1985, Cold War contention began to ease when President Ronald Reagan met with newly appointed Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in Geneva, Switzerland, for 2 days of arms control meetings. Although the two had sharp differences on major subjects, the talks initiated a new trend of openness and paved the way for a series of negotiations that would follow later in the decade.
The most important thing that came out of Geneva was the agreements to meet again. I mean, from a purely political standpoint, both leaders needed to have that meeting, but both of them didn't see it just in terms of their political needs. They saw it as a path. What really came out of Geneva was a feeling on both sides that this was a constructive relationship.
I couldn't help at one point in my discussions privately with General Secretary Gorbachev, when you stop to think that we're all God's children wherever we may live in the world, I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
January 28, 1986 was a day of a great American tragedy. As millions of people watched, the Challenger space shuttle exploded 74 seconds after takeoff.
Here looking very carefully at the situation.
All 7 crew members were killed. Among the tragic losses was Krista McAuliffe, a New Hampshire school teacher who was to have been the first civilian in space.
And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Man will continue his conquest of space, to reach out for new goals and ever greater achievements. That is the way we shall commemorate our 7 Challenger heroes. Dick, Mike, Judy, Elle, Ron, Greg, and Krista, your families and your country mourn your passing. We bid you goodbye. We will never forget you. My fellow Americans, at 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, Air and Naval Forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people
with whom we have no quarrel. On April 5th, in West Berlin, a terrorist bomb exploded in a nightclub frequented by American servicemen. Sergeant Kenneth Ford and a young Turkish woman were killed, and 230 others were wounded, among them some 50 American military personnel. This monstrous brutality is but the latest act in Colonel Gaddafi's reign of terror. I warned that there should be no place on earth where terrorists can rest and train and practice their deadly skills. I meant it. I said that we would act with others if possible and alone if necessary to ensure that terrorists have no sanctuary anywhere. Tonight, we have. Thank you, and God bless you.
Reagan's bold move devastated Gaddafi's inner sanctum and eradicated his resolve for terrorism directed at the United States. Also in foreign affairs that year, Reagan met with Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland, for the next round in arms control talks.
The summit ended abruptly when Jack Matlock, who was the special aide to Reagan, then later our ambassador to the Soviet Union, when it collapsed, said that Reagan reacted to the proposal of Gorbachev to get rid of SDI as if he'd been asked to throw his favorite child into a fiery volcano. In fact, what Gorbachev was asking, the United States could have agreed to, because the program had not gotten beyond the laboratory, and he was asking that Reagan confine it to the laboratory. But Reagan wasn't going to do that, and he walked out, essentially. So here's this summit ends in this sort of abrupt and dramatic way, and the view on both sides of the Atlantic was that it had been a failure. Now, later, both Reagan and Gorbachev agreed that what they had talked about there, which was getting rid of nuclear weapons, led to the INF Treaty, and really out of Reykjavik comes the successes of both leaders in reducing nuclear armaments.
1986 was the year Reagan finally got the aid he so desperately sought for the Contra rebels of Nicaragua. He pressed, pushed, and cajoled members of the Democrat-controlled Congress to give military as well as humanitarian aid to the guerrillas fighting the communist Sandinista government. Meanwhile, Contra controversy continued to brew in Washington as allegations surfaced accusing White House officials of selling illegal arms to Iran in exchange for hostages and then diverting the profits into a fund to support the Contras.
There was a newspaper in Lebanon, Beirut, that came out with a startling article that said the United States was selling arms to Iran, raising funds to help the Contras. And it was so astounding because the law says you can't do that. The Bolin Amendment said you can't do that. It was prohibited. The Neutrality Act also said you can't do that. And so the Senate decided to look into it, and the House decided to look into it.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
Although in the beginning, President Reagan denied any involvement or knowledge of this, in fact, a few days later, he had another press conference and said, yes, I was made aware of this, and thus began the Iran-Contra hearings.
As I've stated previously, I believe our policy goals toward Iran were well-founded. However, the information brought to my attention yesterday convinced me that in one aspect, implementation of that policy was seriously flawed.
I don't think the president himself knew what was going on, but he knew that he wanted to get the hostages out of Beirut, not from Tehran. He wanted to help the Contras. It was no secret. He made that public. And somehow the staff took that as an order from the chief and did all of these illegal things.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not. As the Tower Board reported, what began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated in its implementation into trading arms for hostages. This runs counter to my own beliefs, to administration policy, and to the original strategy we had in mind.
Colonel North, please rise.
The Iran-Contra affair came to a climax in July of 1987 when a congressional panel called Marine Colonel Oliver North to testify on live television concerning his involvement in supplying the Contras with arms.
What did the President know about the diversion of the proceeds of Iranian arms sales to the Contras? Can you tell us what you know about that, sir?
On or about Friday, November 21st, I asked Admiral Poindexter directly, does the President know? He told me he did not. And on November 25th, the day I was reassigned back to the United States Marine Corps for service, the President of the United States called me. In the course of that call, the President said to me, words to the effect that, I just didn't know.
Ronald Reagan had nothing to do with any wrongdoing. It was unauthorized and without his authority and would never have been sanctioned by him. Secondly, he was honest. There was no cover-up in contrast to what had happened in the 1970s. And he made all the facts available, cooperated with the Congress, waived executive privilege, was very forthcoming to get all the facts out. And then thirdly, I think that he refused to let that bring down his administration, and it didn't. There was no reason for it to do so, but he went on to other things and went on, as I say, to the negotiations with the Soviets, to continuing his efforts to lead the world, and ultimately was responsible for all of the things that happened in terms of the ultimately bringing down the Cold War and also putting our military in a posture where they could later on, a few years later, win the Persian Gulf War.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
For over 25 years, the Berlin Wall stood as the symbol of Cold War contention, separating East from West Berlin and marking the dividing line between the world of communism and the world of democracy. Reagan's speech at the Brandenburg Gate in June of 1987 was monumental and marked the beginning of a string of events that would, in a remarkably short span of time, remove this dividing line to the ash heap of history. In December of 1987, the Cold War continued to thaw as Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev sat side by side at a table once used by Abraham Lincoln to sign the most groundbreaking treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union to date.
The INF Treaty, as it's called, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which got rid of all of the intermediate-range nuclear weapons that were pointed at each other across the Iron Curtain in Europe. What makes that so significant is that it was the first time in history that we began to destroy nuclear weapons and eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. That took a lot of confidence building, it took a lot of negotiation, but it was done. And all those nuclear weapons of the INF category are gone. And it was from that base level that we could then start doing other agreements that were very, very helpful.
In 1988, U.S.-Soviet relations continued down the path of peace. And in May, the President made a historic visit to the nation he once described as the evil empire. After speaking at Moscow State University, Reagan walked the streets of Red Square with Gorbachev in a public display of camaraderie that symbolized a new era of East-West relations.
But before things get too far out of hand, we find ourselves standing like this.
Every time Gorbachev came to the United States, and when I was National Security Advisor, whenever we saw him, President Reagan didn't want him to see our guns or tanks. He always wanted to take Gorbachev to a factory. He always wanted to take Gorbachev to a housing development. He always wanted to take him to a shopping mall somewhere. He always wanted to show him what can come from a free democratic, free economic system.
when you have to change horses in midstream, doesn't it make sense to switch to one who's going the same way?
1988 was an election year, and the Republican Party nominated Vice President George Bush to succeed Ronald Reagan and carry the GOP banner for another 4 years.
But George, just one personal request. Go out there and win one for the giver.
George Bush won in a landslide and was inaugurated in January of 1989.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
The time had come for Ronald Reagan to bid farewell as the nation's 40th president.
It's been quite a journey this decade, and we held together through some stormy seas. And at the end, together, we're reaching our destination. The fact is, from Grenada to the Washington and Moscow summits, from the recession of 81 to 82, to the expansion that began in late 82 and continues to this day, we've made a difference. We've done our part, and as I walk off into the city streets, a final word to the men and women of the Reagan Revolution, the men and women across America who for 8 years did the work that brought America back. My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time, we made a difference. We made the city stronger, we made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all. And so, goodbye, God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
I think Ronald Reagan was the most presidential man I ever knew. He knew exactly who he was. He knew exactly what he believed, and he knew exactly where he wanted to go. And those aren't bad. They aren't bad cornerstones for an American president. They have not always been so in every dimension and every aspect.
Ronald Reagan retired to his beloved ranch in Santa Barbara, California. Little did he know that 1989 would be a year of unprecedented democratic reform throughout the world. In March, citizens in the Soviet Union went to the polls to elect their own leadership, the first time since 1917. In June, Poland held free parliamentary elections, and of the 100 seats up for vote, 96 went to Solidarity candidates. This gave Solidarity a firm foothold in Poland's new government and paved the way for Solidarity's chief founder, Lech Walesa, to win the presidential election the following year. Also in June of '89, we witnessed an amazing demonstration in China as idealistic students pushing for democratic reforms put their lives on the line in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. In September, Hungarian border guards were ordered to tear down the barbed wire fence separating Hungary from Austria, and 60,000 people were allowed to leave the country. At long last, the Iron Curtain was opening. In Czechoslovakia, the communist regime was voted out of power, ending a 41-year monopoly. In stepped opposition leader and renowned writer, Václav Havel, as the new president. In November of 1989, the world watched in awe as the Berlin Wall, one of the most notorious and imposing symbols of oppression in the world, was literally knocked down. In Romania, dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was ousted along with his communist regime in December, and the people instilled a provisional government. The momentum of democracy continued into the next decade, and in February of 1990, Nicaragua elected Violeta Chamorro over Daniel Ortega in the country's first free election since the Sandinistas assumed power in 1979. In October of 1990, the border dividing East and West Germany was erased, reunifying the nation after 45 years of separation. That year, the tiny Baltic Republic of Lithuania broke from the USSR by declaring its independence and restoring its 1938 constitution. In September of 1991, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was dissolved. The 70-year-old government structure that began with the Bolshevik Revolution was scrapped. The Cold War was over, and the forces of democracy had prevailed. The world, would never be the same again.
The Reagan administration deserves huge credit for having brought about conditions in which the Cold War could be ended and transcended.
I'm convinced that the most important legacy by far is the legacy that Reagan and Gorbachev left together of ending the Cold War. They didn't do it by themselves. You got to give Bush and Helmut Kohl and Margaret Thatcher and others some credit, but Reagan took the leadership in that, and that's the greatest legacy, because the notion that we had the capacity to incinerate ourselves in a nuclear holocaust was not metaphor, it was true. Now, we still have that capacity, but we're a lot less likely to do it.
As the new world dawned, the sunset of the old world began to fade, and with it, the extraordinary life of Ronald Reagan. In 1994, the former president formally announced that he suffered from Alzheimer's disease. In his letter to the public, Reagan's conclusion affirmed that his grand sense of optimism was as strong as ever. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a brighter dawn ahead. Thank you, my friends, and God bless you.